And for me, the part about this talk that I think is more interesting is what students can do and why you should do something and why it matters. Um, so let's get started. So I'm going to essentially give you a background about child asylum seekers, who they are. It's hard to not give this talk without talking about family separation, given what's been going on in the news recently. And I think, as many of you are embarking on these medical careers, I think it's really important to talk about the issue of dual loyalties, particularly with those who care for immigrant children in detention and elsewhere. And then we'll finish with what I think that you can do if you're interested. So just as far as some disclosures, the last bullet is probably the most important point. I am not paid to do any of this work, as if you probably already guessed. So I'm a pro bono medical expert, and I also do forensic evaluations with PHR. These opinions and the information herein is really my own personal viewpoints, except for when you see some direct information from PHR reports. And then I've also served as a content expert for some of the named lawsuits in this talk, always on the side of immigrant adults and children. So just to make sure that we are all on the same page here, people who've heard me talk know that I almost always start with this slide because I love it. But essentially, without getting too down the details, these are the ways that people enter the United States who are seeking some sort of relief, for the most part. So there's refugees, and then there are people who seek asylum. And it's actually a very similar definition. It's just a matter of kind of how you get here and who says you can be here and when. So, A is a refugee. It's someone who's fleeing some sort of official persecution, but they receive an official status of a refugee before they cross the border, before they even present to the border. So the US Department of State, UNHCR, the Department of Homeland Security, all officially say, yes, you're a refugee, come by when you're ready. And so that's obviously a gross overstatement, but they arrive, they're welcomed, and then, a lot of different things happen. And life's not easy, but you do have an official status. Compared to B, C, and D, which is people who seek asylum, you're actually fleeing the same persecution, but you don't arrive with a specific legal status. And so you may arrive in many different ways. You may arrive with B, where you come on a student visa or a tourist visa, and then you say, I'm here, I would like to apply for asylum, and then you see what happens. You may be in category C, where you're fleeing persecution. You arrive at the border, and you say at the border, I don't have a visa, I don't have papers to be here, but I am seeking asylum. I would like to seek asylum. And then you get detained, and all sorts of things happen, which we'll get to. And there's D, which is when you're the same as C, you come to the border, except for the fact that you either do one of two things. You either present on a visa and then overstay it, and someone finds out, or you come across the border without anyone noticing. And either way, you're eventually noticed in the United States, but then it's a defensive application, meaning that someone's trying to actively deport you because you're no longer here legally, so to speak. And so then it's a defensive application. That one is much harder. We're mostly, for this talk, going to be talking about people who are C. So all the people you think of right now who are stuck at the southern border, who want to seek asylum but are currently being denied that ability to do so. So what about children? So these numbers are a bit old, but they are important because they were when we kind of most recently were kind of had normal numbers of asylum applications for a variety of reasons. So there were about 250,000 asylum applications filed in 2017, of which 10% were granted asylum. If you look at that 25,000 and break it down, 16,000 of those were affirmative, the ones that I talked about where they arrive at the border and say, I'd like to seek asylum. 10,000 were defensive, which means they were in removal proceedings, but they were able to get asylum anyway. And of those ones who arrived at the border and said, please help me, I would like to seek asylum, they're very, very young. So 50% were under 25, and where I work at Children's Hospital in Boston, those are all kids. Actually, a lot of my patients are 30, but so 25 is definitely still considered a child, so to speak, not legally, but kind of emotionally and where one is in life. And in terms of actual children, 30% were 17 years or younger, so they were under 18. So a large portion of people who arrive at the border seeking asylum are children. So this is not a small issue by any means. And so what are these kids experiencing? So this is a study done by PHR between 2014 and 2018, where they looked at all the evaluations that we had done for forensic evaluations, which many of you are familiar with, and went back through them retrospectively and said, what kind of stood out in terms of children. And so of the children that we evaluated for asylum, 80% of them had suffered direct violence themselves. 70% of them had suffered threats of violence or death. 20% had suffered sexual violence, and then the one that kind of gets me the most actually is the 60% who witnessed acts of violence. Those are kids who watched, their mothers being raped. Those are kids who watched their friends being killed by a gang, or who really watched horrific atrocities while they were in their home countries. And then, the other part that's important to know is what it means to be an unaccompanied child. So by definition, an unaccompanied child is someone who has no lawful immigration status in the US. They're not 18, obviously, because they're a child. And there's no legal guardian, either meaning they arrived by themselves or they arrived with someone that the US deemed was not appropriate to take care of them. And so it's important to know kind of where those kids go, because they fall under the custody of the US Department of Health and Human Services, which is different than ICE and Department of Homeland Security. So under DHHS, there's the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So these kids are sent into a very different system where the focus is on health as opposed to having a focus on security. And there's a lot of kids. So in 2019, sorry, it was my husband ordering a pizza for the children that I'm currently not watching. In 2019, there were almost 70,000 children who were referred to ORR. That does not mean there were 70,000 children in ORR custody at any given time. That means over those 12 months, 70,000 children were in ORR's custody, with some filtering in at any given time. And usually there's a couple thousand who are in their custody at any given point. And that's up from 13,000 in 2012. So a large, large number of kids. And so, as I'm sure many of you saw in the news, originally it was 545 and then it was 666. There are a large number of children who are still separated from their parents from 2017. And these were all separated under family separation policies, which we'll get to. And the reason why they're still separated is because we can't find their parents. So these children are still either in ORR custody or they are in the custody of guardians who the government has found, but they have not been able to be reunited with their parents. And so what happened? So, a lot of what we think about with family separation was in 2018, but it's important to kind of get a little bit more history from before then. So in 2005, and I'm kind of cherry picking here some of the history because there's a lot more to it than this, but in 2005, the Bush administration put out Operation Streamline, which was essentially a policy to try to increase prosecutions at the border of illegal border crossing. At that point in time, there were family residential centers, but families were held together in these smaller kind of settings. And if you fast forward to 2014, the demographic of who was arriving at the border really started to change, and there was this notion of the surge. So whereas previously it had been a lot of young single men arriving who were looking for work to be able to send money home to their families in their home countries, in 2014 there started to be a large number of families arriving at the border, and it essentially quadrupled. And so there was this huge influx of families, and then Obama administration was trying to decide what to do. And so where there had been these smaller residential centers, the Obama administration actually built a lot of these much larger, still called family residential centers, but what we now know as detention centers. And they tried to license them as childcare facilities, which was not super successful. Sometimes it was. And so families were starting to be detained for longer periods of time in these less than cozy settings. And so then the Trump administration decided to take these various deterrent policies one step further. And so in the summer of 2017, from July until around October, the administration decided to trial family separation. And so they did this in El Paso, Texas. They purposely decided to separate families. And as we've now read in the news, this was essentially kind of decided behind closed doors. And during that window, they felt that the actual number of people arriving at the border in El Paso had decreased. So they considered it a success. And so Kirstjen Nielsen was told to roll this out. And so on May 7th, there was a national rollout of the family separation policy, which was part of Trump's general zero tolerance immigration policies at the time. And as all of you probably remember, there was an enormous public outcry because there were pictures of children being ripped from their parents. There were just the general public saw all these families being torn apart for really no reason whatsoever. And so it actually only lasted around 6 weeks, from May 7th to June 20th, at which point in time, Trump was really pressured to issue this executive order to halt family separations. But importantly, if you read the executive order, and if you kind of read the behind the scenes parts of the executive order, he issued a halt to separations, but what he wanted really was also for the government to be able to get out this long-standing Flores settlement agreement. So just a little background about that. The Flores settlement agreement was a legal agreement from the late 90s, like 1997, 98, on behalf of Jenny Lisette Flores, who was a little girl at the time who had been in federal custody, and it essentially established the norms by which the government must take care of children who are in their custody. So, and the crux of it is that everything must be in the best interest of the child. So there are limits to how long someone can be held in detention, which is supposed to be around 72 hours, depending on where one is. There are requirements for education, requirements for healthcare, requirements for mental health care. And so, but the big one the government does not like are these limits on detention, because it means they need to get people out. And so he had hoped that if he kind of stopped family separation, that maybe he could get people to finally get out of this agreement, which the government has been trying to get out of for a long time. That did not work. Around the same time, about a week later, in one of the US district courts, one of the judges said, not only do you need to stop family separation, but you also need to reunite everyone who's been separated, and you need to do it fast, because everyone was all over the place. And as we saw by that slide about the 666 children, that didn't happen, because although the government had taken great pains to lay out this really horrific policy to separate families, they had made no plans whatsoever to keep track of them. So there was no sense of where families were, where children were. Children were sent all around the United States, and families did not know where they were during the separation, and oftentimes afterward, the kids could not even recall necessarily all the places that they were. And so during that 6 weeks, even though it was a very short 6 weeks, the government separated almost 3,000 children from their parents, a really enormous number of kids. And I know many of you have kids on the call, and I have children, and when my son hides behind a tree, I have a panic attack for those 30 seconds that I don't know where he is. And so you can only imagine being separated from your child for days to weeks to months, not knowing where they are. It essentially feels like kidnapping. And this picture, which is by a Pulitzer Prize winning photojournalist John Moore for Getty Images, really kind of captures what children felt like. This is a little girl, she was 2 years old, from Honduras, whose mom was being searched and detained at the border. It was right in the height of the family separation policy, so I'm sure they were separated probably days later. And you can see just her anguish at not understanding what's happening with her mother then. So I just told you that family separation ended on June 20th, 2018, right? There was an executive order, there was a court case, it was all done. So that is not true, however. So this was a study that PHR did. It actually came out just before the pandemic really exploded last winter. And they essentially looked at the kind of long-term effects of family separation, so this figure comes from there, and we'll get back to that report in a minute. But essentially it looked from June 2018, right, when family separation, I just told you, ended, to December 2019, so kind of just before the pandemic hit, which is not why we did the report, but that's just the way it worked out. There were an additional 1,142 children separated from their families after it was over. So the government found many ways to continue to separate children. And if you look at these are the numbers by age, about a quarter in each age group, with 300 are under 5 years old. And almost 600 are under 10 years old. I mean, that is just an insane figure, given the developmental stages of kids that young, having no idea what's happening. And the total numbers, so from that El Paso trial that I mentioned in December 2017 through December 2019, and this figure is quoted all over the place, there are about 5,500 children separated from their parents. And that does not include, obviously, everything that's happened since December 2019. So more than 5,500 kids torn from their parents' arms, about half of which were older than 10, and the other half were about younger than 10. So not old at all. And where do these kids go? So I'd mentioned the unaccompanied child definition earlier. So either you arrive at the border by yourself, or you arrive and the government decide that you should not be with that guardian. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes you really do arrive and you're probably being trafficked. And so they appropriately make the decision that that person should not be your guardian. But sometimes the person just can't provide papers that they're your parent, or sometimes they're enacting these family separation policies, so they just take you from your parent anyway. But either way, you would originally go through Customs and Border Patrol, and then you would be shuttled to a family detention center if you're being kept together. And so you'll see on the left, this is the map from the American Immigration Council. Some of these centers still exist and some do not. So the three that currently exist is the one in Leesport, that one's called Berks in Pennsylvania. There's one in Dilley, Texas, the South Texas Family Residential Center, otherwise just known as Dilley, and there's one in Carnes. The other two, Artesia and Taylor, were both open during the Obama administration, and they were closed because they essentially were found to not meet appropriate requirements for holding the children. And so these children were at these, maybe they made it to a family detention center, maybe they didn't, but then they would be shuttled all over to those centers on the right. And so on the right is an incomplete map, because we don't have a full map, because it's not possible to get one, but an incomplete map by ProPublica of various ORR shelters around the country. So these kids were really sent everywhere around the country, sometimes transferred between centers, and their parents had no idea where they were. I also mentioned to you that Flores settlement agreement about how there's supposed to be limits on detention. And meanwhile, kind of throughout this, throughout the prior administration and this current administration, those rules are being broken all the time. So this was a study that was recently released by the Marshall Project about essentially the most recent administration, Trump administration's expansion of child detention. And you can see the pink salmon colored graph in the back are all the kids who have been detained, and the ones who've been detained for more than 72 hours, which again is what it's supposed to be the limit, are the ones in orange. So at any given time, it's usually about half are being detained longer than they're supposed to be. There was the kind of peak was on May 4th, and then you'll see that it really dropped off starting in January 2020 at the height, or not the height, excuse me, at the beginning of the pandemic. And the reason that those numbers have gone down is not because people don't need to seek asylum, it's because we have closed our borders. And so another one of the ways that COVID has really impacted these children's health is that on March 20th, the director of the CDC, Robert Redfield, who I believe will be replaced soon, ordered all the land and coastal ports of entry closed. And he invoked this old quarantine clause of the Public Health Service Act from, I think it was from the 60s, and essentially renewed it indefinitely, and said that to protect our public health, we need to not let people in our country because they may spread COVID. But if you read it really closely, it's incredibly discriminatory. So essentially, when you read it closely, the only people it applies to are people without papers, and the only people who arrive without papers are those who are seeking asylum. So it doesn't apply to people who are engaged in commerce or who have other valid reasons for travel, who, as far as I know, COVID doesn't pick who it infects. So whether you're seeking asylum or transporting some goods legally, you are still just as likely to pass it on to other people. So it's very discriminatory. It doesn't actually protect our public health whatsoever. It violates a ton of protocols. So it violates the Refugee Protocol from 1967, the Refugee Act, which is our actual domestic law from 1980. And then in terms of children, it violates the bipartisan 2008 Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which that act says a lot of things, but one of the things it says is that if you're at risk of trafficking as a child, then the US must protect you. And so all of these unaccompanied children who are stuck at the border are stuck in these very, very dangerous settings at the camps on the southern side of the border, where they're at very high risk of being trafficked and being abused. And so it is illegal for us to not let them in the country, but that's what we're currently doing. So since this order was started in March, and actually I updated this slide, but it looks like I didn't save it, so I apologize. So those numbers are wrong. So it's actually more than 150,000 people. So these numbers, those are old numbers. More than 150,000 people have been expelled. I find that word a little confusing. Expelled to me means that they were in here and then we pushed them out. But what it means for the sake of this law is actually that they were just never allowed in. So more than 150,000 people presented themselves and we said, no, you can't come. And actually more than 8,800 were unaccompanied children. So there are now almost 9,000 children who we have not allowed to be in our country and who we have broken the TVPA on behalf of. And so, not surprisingly, you saw that drop off where asylum seekers theoretically weren't coming into our country, but we really weren't allowing them. People started predicting that this was going to be a problem in our detention centers. And so, Matt Gartland, who's a colleague of mine, and several of his other colleagues wrote this paper in the Lancet, essentially saying COVID-19 was going to be worse in detention centers. It seems like that's not really worth publishing, because it seems like it should be common sense, but it wasn't. But it's not common sense, and so this is why we must publish things and why we must write and gather data. And they were right. So in ORR settings, where a lot of these unaccompanied children are that I told you about, there started being cases of workers. More workers, and then actually in children. This is a Chicago shelter that had 37 children that were infected. And again, this is not entirely pediatric illness. It can be. We have kids in my ICU right now who actively have COVID and MIS-C, but it also is a matter of public health in terms of spreading it. And actually, we recently documented a group, actually, so that all the authors on this paper, is important to know, besides myself and Dr. Mashuri, everyone was a medical student. And the lead author on this paper was a medical student. And so essentially, we took ICE's data that was publicly available, but very difficult to obtain because of the way that they put it on their website. And we essentially showed that there are massive numbers of the case rates in ICE detention are much, much higher than they are in the general United States population. And the reason why this is important is because the family detention centers are all under the purview of ICE. So all the unaccompanied children are in ORR, but all the children who are with their families are in ICE custody at Carnes, Dilley, and Berks. And so the most recent numbers here, in Carnes in Southern Texas, there are 89 cases, currently 0, but this changes from day to day. I just checked this maybe an hour ago. In the Dilley Center, also in Southern Texas, there are 8 cases total, 3 which are currently active. Berks, there actually have been none. They really have decongregated a lot of these facilities. Berks, there have been none, although there was a case just a week or 2 ago, an employee who actually was a clinician who was fired. I don't fully understand why they were fired, but they were the first positive case, so it remains to be seen if other cases emerge. And then in ORR custody, so not in ICE, that data is actually not really publicly available unless you look back in the kind of footnotes of these legal cases. There have been around 250 cases in the children. So this is not talking about employees now or like kind of total numbers. There have been 250 cases in children, and that's of September 11th, because that was the most recent data I could find. And so, so what ended up happening with family separation? So I told you it ended. It obviously didn't end. And then in the midst of the pandemic, in mid-May, lawyers at all 3 family residential centers started getting reports from their clients. There's a lot of nonprofit legal centers that kind of house themselves and represent people, or at least educate them about their rights in detention centers. And so families started telling the attorneys that they were given this binary choice where they essentially could give up the rights of their child to the US government, like hand them over to DHHS and ORR. And then they would probably honestly be either remain detained forever or deported, or they could both remain in detention indefinitely. And so, a lot of attorneys talked about this being a Sophie's choice, like you're in a burning house. Do you either just save yourself, just save your child, or stay in the burning house? Like there's not really a good option there. And so, and fortunately for these families, they spoke up. They didn't just kind of cower, even though it's very, very scary and very disempowering to be in detention. They told their attorneys, and people started making a lot of noise. And so in June, the US District Court Judge Dolly G, who's the judge who's in charge of the Flores settlement agreement, she actually ordered that all children had to be released from detention amidst the pandemic. They were given a certain amount of time to do this, but she basically said that, having listened to a lot of evidence, that it made no sense to keep kids in detention during this pandemic for their health, for everyone else's health, for the employees' health, for the attorneys that help them, et cetera. And so that was in the case Flores versus Barr, which I was also part of. And again, medical students really helped me a lot with a lot of the background information for that case. But unfortunately, in July, U.S. District Court Judge Boasberg, who is in DC, who had, for the most part, all spring been following along, meaning that whenever Judge G ordered something for the children, he would kind of order a similar thing for the adults, because he was in charge of the adult kind of detained class of immigrants, which was under the name OMG. But unfortunately, in July, he did not follow what she had said. So on July 22nd, his order was not that adults needed to be released. And so suddenly the government, who had already been asking families to separate, felt they had essentially this kind of court-ordered mandate where they had to release children, but they weren't allowed to release adults. And so they kind of use this as a reason to do further family separation. When in reality, there was it's not that the judge said they couldn't release adults. He had just said that they weren't mandated to release adults. ICE has the purview to release people singularly, as well as families as a unit, anytime they want to. That is within their prerogative to do so. They just choose not to. Unfortunately, throughout the fall, there's been a lot of back and forth, and Judge G, who really is only in charge of the family, she certainly understands that the best interest of the child is to remain with their parents, but she is not in charge of their parents. She ordered the attorneys for the Flores class, so the detained children, and the Department of Homeland Security to essentially agree upon a binary choice model by December 4th. So we'll see what happens. So, the best outcome that could be within that setting is that there would be much better tracking of families, that they would be reunited quickly, et cetera. However, but the best option overall that we've been working on is just to try to tell ICE to release families together, because that's what makes most sense from a public health standpoint, and that's what makes most sense from a child rights standpoint and family rights standpoint. And so kind of, not surprising, all of this has had really detrimental effects on children. So this study, as I mentioned before, is before the pandemic, but you can kind of just extrapolate that everything I'm about to tell you is even worse now that we're in a pandemic. So PHR looked at 26 evaluations that we had done of people who had been separated during the original family separation back in 2018. And evaluated kind of what the effects were of that separation. Most families said that they were fleeing violence and death threats. Kids had a really hard time talking about what was going on, what had happened to them when they were alone. Most parents said the reason why they left was for the safety of their kids. The families had been forcibly separated, and they really didn't know why. They didn't understand. They feared that they were never going to see each other again. The kids, as I showed you in that map, were sent all over. The families report that detention center conditions were terrible. And then the important thing that we kind of got asked to review was these parents who struggled with their credible fear interview. So if you went way back to that first slide that I showed you of what happens when you seek asylum, if you come without papers, but you present and say, I'd like to seek asylum, then you're detained. And then the first step actually is to do this CFI, or credible fear interview. And essentially that's the interview where you show that something terrible has happened to you in your home country. It meets the certain criteria that people are allowed to seek asylum for, and you have a credible fear that if we return you to your home country, something very bad will happen to you. You'll be very injured, you will be killed, things along those lines. And so the problem with the CFI is that families arrived, they were then separated from their children, they didn't understand why or what happened, and then maybe a day later they had this CFI. And it was basically the most important interview of their lives. And then when they were asked why they were seeking asylum, the only answers they got was like, where's Johnny? Where's Maria? They couldn't answer these at all with any sort of intelligible answer, because they were so confused and scared and sad about where their kids were that the CFIs made no sense. And so they all uniformly failed their CFIs. And so we were asked to come in and essentially comment on the psychological impact of being separated from their children, to then have the lawyers give rationale for why their CFI should be redone, which again seems obvious probably to me and you, but needed to be done from an official standpoint, and was a successful policy, so to speak. So I'm not going to read all these quotes. You should read the report. I highly recommend it. It's free to download. But essentially, people experienced really terrible things. The only one I do want to read is the middle one, which is by a PHR psychologist who's describing this mother that she met from El Salvador. And so the psychologist says, the mother asked the official why her daughter was being taken away from her. The official reportedly responded that her daughter was going to be adopted by an American family and she would be deported and she would never be able to see her daughter again. I mean, that is just, that is the worst thing in the world. You know, someone basically almost taunting her for, you know, having the gall to seek asylum, to try to seek safety, to go on this terrible journey and bring her daughter for the sake of her daughter, and then to have her taken away, which is, it's illegal and it's immoral. This is a little boy. You can see the anguish on his face. He and his family arrived. They were separated. He and his father were eventually reunited and sent back, but his mom was still in the United States. And you can just see the anguish on his face as he's talking to his mom, who's still in the US, and he's back in Guatemala. So, you know, these are all the parents in that study. Most of them suffered, met criteria for PTSD as well as depression. And really, when you looked at the symptoms that met those diagnoses, they were almost all related to the separation itself. Obviously, a lot related to what had happened in their home country, but a lot of it from the actual separation. And same with the children. And then you also just look at the ages of these children, right? Look at the left-hand column. There's one 17-year-old, but everyone else is less than 10. So all these kids were separated. Look at the duration. Most of them were away from their parents for 2 months. That is an insanely long period of time to essentially be kidnapped. And so PHR looked at all this data, looked at the laws, and concluded that these policies officially met the UN definition of torture and enforced disappearance. So torture, because the policy caused severe physical or mental suffering. It was certainly done intentionally, right? It was an official policy. It was done for coercion, punishment, or intimidation. It was a purposeful deterrent policy, and by a state official or with state consent. This was part of the zero tolerance policy of the Trump administration. And then enforced disappearance, which is essentially, again, the fancier word for kidnapping, where you have any deprivation of liberty by the state, where there's concealment of the fate or the whereabouts of a disappeared person. The number of times that people asked where their kids were and got, I don't know, or we can't tell you, is too numerous to count. And honestly, a lot of the times that the answer was, I don't know, was because the actual person really didn't know, because I told you they weren't keeping track of where everyone was going. So even if someone wanted to have some sort of good intentions to let a mother know where her son was, it was not very likely they were gonna be able to figure it out very easily. And then again, so some of the authors on the original report worked with some other authors and actually wrote a similar kind of perspective piece published in Pediatrics actually just about 2 weeks ago now, stating that the treatment of migrant children on the southern border is torture. And this is a really, really powerful statement. So PHR's report was incredibly powerful and impactful and cited by a lot of people. And this article in Pediatrics is really, really impactful also because it's the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. So the AAP is saying the US government is committing torture. That is an enormously powerful statement, and a really just impressive that they stood behind this and they published it in their flagship journal. And so the hope is that this will really move things forward. And so, you know, all these kids, there's just compounding trauma upon trauma upon trauma. So they have the trauma that they suffered in their home country. We didn't even talk about all the trauma they suffered en route to the US. There's tons of books about that. There's, you know, children riding on trains who lose limbs, who are kidnapped, who are sexual violence, like really bad stuff en route to the US. And lots of times, it's many times that they have to try 5 or 6 or 10 times to even get up here successfully, because they're caught by authorities and sent back. There's a trauma being separated from your family. There's a trauma just being detained, right? Kids are not meant to be incarcerated. No one's meant to be incarcerated, but certainly kids who've done nothing wrong are not supposed to be incarcerated. That's a terrible place to grow up, to live, to develop. And so that's very traumatic. And then there's the trauma of living in a detention center during a pandemic. So if you're with your family, you're scared. If you're by yourself, you're even more scared. You don't understand what's going on. You don't know if you're going to get sick, if you're going to die. You don't know where your parents are, if they're going to get sick, they're going to die. Maybe they went home to a different country that has even worse, you know, public health measures than we do. And so it's really, really, really scary. And COVID has essentially just heightened all of these terrible things and made them so much worse. particularly in the fact that the government has essentially used this pandemic as a reason to enforce even stricter immigration policies with respect to further family separation, with respect to closing the borders. They've just worsened an already terrible situation. And so what does this mean for the people who care for all these children? A lot of you are going to be caring for children. You're going to take a lot of different jobs, right? You might take jobs at hospitals. You might take jobs at a clinic. Maybe you'll work at a jail. Maybe you'll be a policy person. Maybe you'll end up working in a foster care system. I don't know, but that you will have a lot of different demands on you. And so, and I think it's important to know that it's very easy to demonize the government as like one big machine, but there are a lot of really wonderful and lovely people who work within the various institutions of our government and its related branches. And it is for those people, it is very hard to understand kind of how to proceed with your job given the different orders that you have. And so government attorneys, judges, asylum officers, clinicians, all these people have to balance their various mandates, professional and legal mandates. The problem being that they are all mandated to protect children, but they also have to follow these government policies that directly hurt children. So they deport children, they make them lose their medical care, or they remove them from family members. And the one that I like to highlight the most, that I think is the most interesting, is immigration judges. And this is one that we really need to work on trying to fix. So the immigration judges have the legal mandate to exercise independent judgment. That's what it means to be a judge. And the reason why this should work is that there's a separation of the judiciary branch from the legislative and the executive branches of government, except for immigration court. So immigration court is actually part of the executive branch. And so those judges report to the U.S. attorney, and the U.S. attorney is the same person who instructs the government attorneys to prosecute and deport undocumented immigrants. So it is very hard to be a balanced and objective judge. And some judges are, but it's not quite as straightforward as being a judge in other branches. And kind of the most brazen example of dual loyalties is this ad that was pulled from JAMA. It was placed and then JAMA took it down when there was a huge public outcry. But essentially, this was an ad to work at GEO Group, which is one of the private for-profit organizations that runs some of the many detention centers by ICE. And they had looked for a doctor. You'll see on the left, the salary was $400,000. Just to give you some heads up, you will not be making that when you become a doctor for the most part. Maybe a few of you, but most of us do not. And so there's already that incentive financial to take this job. And the ad said it was seeking a physician who can examine and treat correctional facility detainees and inmates to ensure proper injury care, disease prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and recovery, right? Seems fine, that's what doctors do. But they also have to be philosophically committed to the objectives of the facility. That is harder to do. It is hard to work for a facility that is dedicated to detaining children and doing things that are purposely bad for the health of the people who live there. And so there was a huge outcry about this, and it was taken down. But there's a lot of people are pulled in many different directions when they work in these types of areas. And throughout this, there have been a lot of ways that people have been fighting for the rights of children. So there have been various legal cases, the one I told you about, Flores v. Barr or OMG versus Wolf. There's been a ton of investigative reporting. NBC, the New York Times, a lot of local, really wonderful reporters in Texas and Arizona have done a lot. There have been advocates and lawyers and clinicians on the ground. I'm sure many of you heard about the kids who are being held in hotels, basically bypassing the entire immigration system. They were being held kind of by ICE, kind of by people contracted by ICE, certainly not people who are trained to take care of children. And the reason why that was found out is because a bunch of lawyers in Texas kind of pushed their way into these hotels and motels and videotaped them and then just got the word out. And eventually it became, Judge G, that same judge I told you about, had to make an official order. You can't do that. So a lot of the work has been on the ground, has been very, very, very powerful. And so, with the last few minutes of my talk, I just want to talk about why, where you come in here. So what you do matters. It matters to all of these people. It matters, a lot of those cases I talked about, a lot of the background information was gathered by students. And a lot of the voices that have been lent to this work have been done by students. It matters to you because it's going to influence your career. And then I would say it matters to me because I really for me, this work is important because I help other people, but I also really, really like working with students. And I would not still do this if there were no students. I really wouldn't, because I learn so much more from students than I do just kind of doing things on my own. Um, and these are just this is a very tiny list of students who I've worked with recently, I would say in the last 12 months, who've done an enormous amount of work. And I think it's important also to kind of tell you kind of how I got here, because I feel like sometimes, at least when I was a student, it was very hard for me to kind of see my way forward. I started out, first of all, I wasn't even pre-med. I studied history and French. And I ended up doing a post-bac for a couple of years. During that time, I started taking medical anthropology classes, mainly because I had the word medical in it, and I thought that would like look good to medical schools, not because I had any idea what the hell that was, frankly. And that's when I started reading books about health and human rights. I kind of Googled and found out about PHR. I attended this very same conference in Chicago, maybe 18 years ago. That was just massively inspiring. And so I started driving to Boston every single weekend to go to PHR events and PIH events. I founded our chapter at Dartmouth when I was a medical student there, and I did kind of standard things that students do. I hosted talks, and I talked to my legislators. The minute I got my MD, I joined PHR's asylum network, and I did my first evaluation on my own. There was no one. It's funny now because Michigan is such a huge place for this, but back then there was no one there. So I just did my first evaluation by reading the asylum bill protocol, doing an evaluation, and then asking the child abuse specialist doctors to help me because they were forensic specialists, even though they didn't do anything with immigration. And then I went to a training, and then I started writing more. And then I went to residency. I went to fellowship in critical care, which again seems really disjointed, but I only tell you this because I feel like sometimes people feel like, oh, I want to go into surgery, maybe I can't do some immigration stuff anymore. Oh, I want to do, dermatology, I can't do this immigration stuff anymore. No matter what you want to do clinically, you can still do human rights work regardless of the specialty, because it's all relevant and it's all interesting. And so I did critical care, and honestly, it does not have a lot to do with my human rights work, but I love it. I enjoy it. It affords me the time to do this, having a shift work schedule. And so I started doing more and more, and I kind of forced PHR to know who I was. I kept on emailing them, and I kept writing more things, and I kept doing more evaluations. And so and then 20 years later, this is where I am doing lots of writing, lots of reading, and working with med students. Like that JAM paper was all with med students. Those PHR reports that you saw have a lot of medical student authors on them. There's one that we're working on coming out soon, again, with all medical student authors. So all this work can be done by you, and it's all really, really important. These are just some of the pieces, all of which have medical student authors in the last 6 months. And so there's just a lot of the noise about what's been going on has been done by students. And it's really important because you have a really important voice. You're smart. You understand how to educate people. You know how to write. And for those of you who don't, just ask us and we're happy to help you. And then also, as we have seen with many disinformation campaigns, the more evidence we can get out there, the further we can get. And so we need to know, you really have to figure out, like, what do we actually know, right? Like, I'm like that Lancet piece saying that COVID was probably going to be an issue in detention centers makes very obvious sense. But ICE has made it really hard to know that for sure. And so we said, like, we all kind of know this, but we need to prove it. And so we figured out how to use their data to actually prove it. And it was true. And it's they have not liked it. They have, every time reporters have asked them about it, their answer really is like, how did they figure that out? Because they were surprised that we were able to use their data, because they've made it purposely difficult. And then how do you disseminate that information? Information is only useful if you actually share it with people. And so all these things are important to figure out. These are just other articles that kind of lend evidence. And so what can you do and what should you do? So I would say, there's a lot of immigration courts are back up and running. And so forensic evaluations remain incredibly important for your asylum clinics, and you can do them remotely. Sometimes they do need to be done in person, but mostly they're being done remotely. And PHR has a lot of great videos for how to do those remotely now. those expert declarations that we've written for a lot of these legal cases, all of them require a massive amount of background research, and that's been very, very helpful to have students do it, and it's been successful. We've had a lot of detainees released directly as a result of the expert declarations, which are a direct result, their power is a direct result of medical student and other student background research. Call your hospital and see what they're doing. Like, ask what their legislative affairs offices are doing and offer to help. Because then you can actually do something locally. Again, if they align with your views. If they don't align with your views, then make your hospital know why your views matter. You know, maybe their views are wrong. A lot of hospitals, shockingly, have been unwilling to sign these basic statements saying that racism is a public health crisis. And you would think now in this day and age, that's a pretty easy letter to write, right? Like, it's pretty easy to sign that. It's you know, if nothing else, it's great PR, but hopefully you just believe it because it's true. But a lot of hospitals have really worried about signing these letters because they're worried about alienating some of their racist customers. And so call your hospital and see what they're up to and either work with them or make them do better. And I also really encourage you to go to, if you haven't done already, to the Biden campaign's website. They are our incoming administration, and you should actually read through all their policies. You know, the immigration policies are the ones that I focused on, and they have a ton of them. They have made a lot of promises for the first 100 days. Do I think they're going to do all those things in 100 days? No, but I applaud them for stating they're going to, one of which is ending family separation. But I would see what they are and decide which one or two of those things do you really want to work on, because they need to be held accountable. You know, just because we're excited that the administration may be changing does not mean that everything's going to be, you know, perfect at the end of January. It won't be. And so we need to hold them accountable, and we need to demand more. Like, it's not an exhaustive list by any means, and start planning. And then if you need help, just ask us. Everyone at PHR loves helping students, like, a lot. And we want to help, and we want you to email us. And so I'll just leave you with my contact information. Those of you who know me know that I am terrible at email. But I also, my little caveat is that I never, ever, ever mind being reminded. So if you want to write to me and you don't hear from me in 3 days, just write again. Just say, like, hey, you probably missed this, and I probably missed it, or I forgot, or who knows, but you can email me every 3 days and I will never find it annoying. Like, please do. I always want to hear from people. And I'm happy to work on basically anything else that you think is important and that's worthwhile for children and worthwhile for parents. You know, children are the byproduct of adults. And so I do not restrict myself to working with just kids. So I think that that's where I'll end. I'm happy to take a few questions if you guys have any, or give you a break.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Peeler, for that really incredibly informative and interesting presentation. And we have a bunch of questions in the chat. And I'll leave that to the rest of our PHR team to ask them. But yeah, thank you again for just an amazing presentation and for being so passionate about helping students as well. It means a lot to us as medical students. So you guys can take it away with the questions.
All right, I just had a quick question. So I heard a lot about the presence of sanctuary cities throughout the country that help asylum seekers. I was just wondering if they've been specifically impacted by the Trump admin since the pandemic started. And
in what way do you mean?
In terms of resources, healthcare resources.
I can't say officially. I mean, the Trump administration, as you probably have gleaned, does not like the idea of sanctuary cities. It doesn't like the idea of people not following its orders. And so they have tried to make it really hard for sanctuary cities to be sanctuary cities, and there have been a lot of threats to take away various government resources related to both to immigrants, but also just to, like, the general population. Mm-hmm. And their reason for doing so is that maybe if they take away resources for the general population who may or may not be interested in helping immigrants may try to pressure the local government to not be a sanctuary city. So I don't know, it's really variable depending on which city you're in, but they certainly have tried to make it harder.
Mm-hmm. Another follow-up question. Are there any, so we talked a lot about policies that were against refugees and asylum seekers. are there any policies that are directed towards educating them and preparing them for the citizenship exam?
Ooh, I don't know. Not gonna make up things I don't know, but that's a great question. There is education about lots of things. So, you know, a lot of these legal nonprofits, Raices is the one that I work with the most, which is housed in Texas. They work on a lot of know your rights campaigns. I don't know kind of who works on other types of education, but they work on both know your rights campaigns within the actual detention center. So people understand what the CFI is, just like the importance and why it matters and what asylum is. And then they also work on making sure people get kind of like, especially children, get general education they're supposed to get. It's not always successful, but that's one of the things that they work on.
Okay.
I don't know about the citizenship exam. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Our next question is going to come from a student directly. I would like to invite Shazeb to read his question out.
Hi, Dr. Peeler. Your presentation was amazing. My name is Shazeb Patel, and I'm the public relations for PHR's Johns Creek High School chapter.
Okay.
And our chapter is focused specifically on human trafficking. So I would want to know, like, as a doctor, like human trafficking survivors are usually, they have extreme emotional trauma. And so like, how would you deal with these like types of patients, and what as high school students can we do to like help those people that like, and reach out to them and help them in any way that we can?
So first of all, I'm super excited that there are people from high school here. I was not informed or cool enough to have been on this type of conference then. Just played a lot of soccer, but there's a lot in that question. The first thing I would just say in terms of like educating yourself further, if you're not already part of it, is the HEAL trafficking listserv. I don't know if you're part of that. That is this grassroots organization that was started by Hani Stoklosa, who also did a ton with PHR back when she and I knew each other from our PHR student days. And she's now at Mass General or Brigham. But it's turned into this enormous network of providers, which is a very broad term, all over the country, and who provide a lot of education about trafficking resources, trafficking research, and trafficking education. So definitely it's HEAL, like HEAL. So do that. And then in terms of, it's an enormous amount of trauma. And there are a lot of people who are seeking asylum have been trafficked, either en route or sometimes when they arrive here. My very first case actually that I ever did, that one I told you about in Michigan, she came for one reason, but she actually arrived and stayed with her mother's friend. Her mother had arranged for her to stay with her friend because her mother was still back in her home country. And her mother's friend actually ended up putting her in a hair braiding trafficking ring. And so there were all these other things that happened to her after she arrived in the United States. And so in terms of the trauma, they need dedicated mental health experts, and I actually would not be the one that would treat them since that's not my specialty. The thing that's important for me and for other people like me is to make sure to not further the trauma when we do our history for our forensic evaluation. And that's a whole other separate talk, but it's a very, very, it's a really important and also educating those who also interact with people. So educating asylum officers, educating people who work at detention centers about how to interact with children who've already suffered trauma, whether it be from trafficking or for something else.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Where are you in high school again?
Johns Creek High School.
What city?
Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta. Awesome. Cool.
All right. I would like to invite Melissa to ask the next question.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Peeler. It's such a timely, important topic, both theoretically and practically. So the thing is, I am a psychology student at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And I was wondering about the Harvard Medical School Asylum Clinic. And I was wondering about also the PHR asylum clinics and whether they're accepting clinical, like I would like to do clinical work. So I was wondering if they do clinical or counseling psychologists are able to assist these vulnerable populations. Thank you.
That's a great question. So our clinic, and I would say I don't want to speak for everyone, but most of the clinics that are part of the kind of PHR student network of clinics are non-treating clinics. So they are mostly, if not all, forensic evaluation clinics. So an attorney essentially has someone who's seeking asylum or some other similar type of immigration-related relief, and they realize the person has either physical evidence of the trauma in their home country or psychological evidence of maybe something that happened in their home country, and they want a clinician, which is a broad term, to evaluate them and to state whether or not those symptoms are consistent with the trauma they had in their home country. Because if it is, that's just a further layer of evidence to prove that they should be granted asylum. And so we document those symptoms, and then we categorize consistency of those symptoms with the actual trauma. And so, but we don't do any treating. And so certainly we have lots of psychologists who work in our clinic who help us, who do the evaluations for the psych needs. And I would say that you should get in touch with the general PHR student board and find out which clinic is closest to you. And each clinic has its own rules as to who can and cannot work there. But even if you end up not being able to work with your local student chapter, I suspect kind of once you're done with your getting your credentials, you could be trained by PHR and be a general PHR evaluator. And we'd love to have you.
Thank you.
Does anyone else? I think Rebecca, you had a question. Do you want to ask your question directly?
Sure. Hi. Amazing as always. So one of the things that came up for me, and I always like to think about it in terms of what you said, this time, which was, in providing evidence for things that seem really obvious. And one of those things that I've been trying to figure out how to evaluate is how asylum seekers living in the United States have, had, what access have they had to healthcare during the pandemic, and what have their health outcomes been. And I've sort of been stuck on the, people with refugee status who are refugees from Afghanistan who have like special status, but understanding the health outcomes for people who don't have that status and are sort of just asylum seekers who are, hard to access has been more difficult. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how we could better research that population kind of throughout the United States.
Yeah, we were going to try to do that, and then we got stuck. So we did something different, which you'll see soon in December or January. But we essentially looked more at people who were in detention and what their experiences were. But in terms of, the general larger population, I would say, so, really think about your question, which I think is a good question, but kind of you try to be as specific as you can when asking that question, because the more specific you are, the easier forward the method will become. And then I would say to partner with people, right? So who would know where some of those people might be? So probably some nonprofit attorneys, right, that do immigration law. But again, that's not everyone, because a lot of people who are seeking asylum, or who maybe aren't seeking asylum but probably should, maybe they don't have access to attorneys, so that's a self-selecting population. Maybe local churches. I met recently with a student who's amazing. She just finished college, and she's not even applying for medical school yet, but will eventually, who actually interviewed like 80 people at some local faith-based shelters just before, just last summer, and basically understood how family separation had affected them. But she has this really amazing cache of interviews, but she had found it really hard. So she just kind of went down to Texas. Obviously, I said no to her like 800 times when she tried to get into detention centers. So then she just reached out and she went to a bunch of these faith-based shelters. So just try to figure out who helps people. Like maybe a food shelter would give you access to some people, not everyone. And so once you find your partners, then you can ask them what they think. They'll probably have a better research question than you do. And then you can actually talk to the people who you want to study, who probably have an even better question. But I would say that's probably the mode of way I would do it. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to help.
Yeah, we'll probably reach out to you, but that's really helpful.
Sure.
I believe Chelsea will be reading the next question.
Yep, so our next question asks, part of the reason why not many people have an interest in the issue of separating children is because the narrative dictated by the government currently is that these people are illegal migrants and they are not supposed to be here in the first place. So how do we reconcile the public interest in border security on one hand and human rights of asylum seekers on the other hand?
So that's a great question, right? You have to meet people where they are. So on the one hand, I would say twofold. I think, I think that everyone here probably wants to believe that everyone in the world has everyone else's best interest at heart, but that is not always the case. Sometimes it is. Most people have their own best interest at heart. They have their own children's best interest at heart. Like they do care for other people, but how that expands is different for every person, right? For sometimes very valid reasons. And so I think you have to figure out what matters to people. And so family separation, I would actually say, has really struck at the heart of many people who actually do not, many people who would love to have stricter immigration laws, who do not want a lot of immigrants here. But when they saw children being torn from their families, like that was just one step too far. And so actually there was a huge public outcry by people who otherwise support very stringent immigration policies, but who said like family separation is just ridiculous. Like figure something else out. That's not okay. But I will say in terms of other immigration policies, there's a lot you have to figure out what matters to people. So I think on the one hand, I think more education, but to everyone about why this matters, why it's important is good, but it has to be in a way that's not condescending, that's not elitist, which I think a lot of times it comes off as. And then the other thing I think is like figure out what else matters. So the other thing that matters to people is money, right? Detention centers are wildly expensive, and you know who makes tons of money? All of these private corporations. So Core Civic makes a ton of money, Geo Group makes tons of money. And so, talk about how much the taxpayers are paying for all of these people who do not need to be detained, almost all of them have places they could stay. They all have family members who are already here. They all have friends who are already here. And so they could be saving tons of money by not detaining people that don't need to be detained whatsoever. And there's many of really well-proven alternatives to detention that we could use instead. And they're cheaper. And so I think figuring out what matters to people and targeting, have a multi-pronged attack is probably the best way of doing it. And then I think small things, and they're not small, but to me, they're critical, is trying to get people talking to one another, right? Like this pandemic is really bad for that because there's no soccer games going on, like there's no playing in the playground going on. And so people don't get to see that their neighbors who may be immigrants are just people like them. And so I think with having a lot less social interaction, it's actually much easier to be xenophobic and easier to be racist because you're not confronted and you're not understanding who your neighbors are and how we're all just people.
Thank you again, Dr. Peeler. Personally, I learned a lot from your presentation, and I felt like your call to action for us students at the very end was particularly effective. Us at CUNY, when we planned this conference, our biggest hope was that our participants could come and ask our speakers questions and leave with a clearer vision of what our role in the human rights world could be and what we can do to make a difference. So thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Peeler. And I don't know if anybody else has any, I know it's past 7, so I don't want to keep you longer, Dr. Peeler.